Hello, welcome to Chapter 1 from Learning Unit 1. This is the introduction to accounting and financial reporting for governments and not-for-profit organizations. To complete this learning unit, Learning Unit 1, you need to read Chapter 1, do the Connect Learn Smart, which is also called Smart Book on Connect, do Problem Set 1 in Connect, and participate in the first 3 discussion boards. Now let me point out that discussion board number 1 is merely an introduction to the rest of the class, worth 100 points. Discussion board number 2 is merely an acknowledgement that you've looked at the syllabus and you understand it. Discussion board number 3 is actually a discussion about Chapter 1 where you make some comments, roughly 3 or 4 sentences, and it deals with things germane to the chapter, and once you do that, you get 80 points for doing that. Okay, so I pulled off an extra page here, and so you might have been starting to see what was actually required in the next slide. But one of the things I wanted to talk for you a minute about is how to do Learn Smarts. A lot of people at first don't quite understand this. So first you get into Learning Unit 1, and you'll find 4 sections. One of them will be assignments, which just basically is a recap of what I just had on the last slide. Tells you what's due during the week. You'll see a link to the discussion board for questions. This is called Quiet Side of the Asteroid. You'll see a multimedia folder with things like this video, and also PowerPoints. And then you'll see an assessments folder. Now, this whole thing, all of this from Learning Unit 1 to the end of the class, is found in course content, which if you look at the left side of your Blackboard page, you'll see it as a link to course content. And then in course content, you find Learning Unit 1, and this is how you get to what I'm talking about. So when you get into Learning Unit 1, then you get into the Learning Unit 1 Assessments folder. And this number 1 here is missing the word assessments. It should have said that. Find the Learning Unit number 1 Assessments folder in course content. So then you find the link to Chapter 1, Intro to Financial Reporting for Governments and Non-for-Profit Organizations. And you click that. And this brings you to Smart Book. And some people don't always know exactly how to get started on the assignment for this, but at the bottom left, there's a section called Practice. And if you click this, click Practice at the lower left, you actually begin your assignment. Well, we're now going to talk a little bit about the subject matter in Chapter 1. So this video is not designed to keep you from having to read. It's not designed to be a full lecture on the topic, but it does have a relatively short video with some of the important parts, more important discussions that we go through in Chapter 1. So one of those is the difference between a public and a private organization. Remember, we're only talking about nonprofits here. So we could add the term public versus nonprofit nonprofit organizations, public versus private nonprofit organizations, because we're not talking about for-profit organizations. So a public one is controlled by the government. A private one may be a business, but it cannot be a government. Also, by definition, not-for-profit organizations don't have a profit motive. Well, one of the things that we really need to start off with early in the class is trying to figure out where the authority comes from. Where do the rules come from? So we have something called the Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board, FASB. And basically, this by itself is a private group who's given authority by the government to set standards for federal financial reporting. So this group issued 6 concepts, which they called Statements of Federal Financial Accounting Concepts. And number 1, which kind of lays out what the government's trying to do with reporting, is an indication of the objectives in non-for-profit reporting, federal non-for-profit reporting. First, we're interested in operating performance. Second, we're interested in systems and control. Third, we're interested in stewardship. And fourth, we're interested in budget integrity. Well, most of you will have thought some about normal accounting before you really start to think about governmental accounting. And if you thought some, for example, you had to have Accounting 211. In Accounting 211, we explain that generally accepted accounting principles for-profit businesses are handled by FASB, Financial Accounting Standards Board. Well, there are several sources of government generally accepted accounting principles. Notice it's still generally accepted accounting principles, but this is unique to governments. So first, as we just mentioned on the last slide, we have FASB, which is the source of federal government GAAP. We have the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, which is the source for state and local government GAAP. We have FASB, Financial Accounting Standards Board, the same group that does for-profit accounting, that deals with non-government, non-for-profit organizations. Recognize these are organizations that aren't in business to make a profit, but they're also not government-oriented. FASB handles them too. And the Financial Accounting Foundation, FAF, is sort of the oversight body that handles most of the rules. So they oversee both GASB and FASB. They really don't issue standards, rather they cause FASB and GASB to issue them. Well, one of the things that it might interest us to do is stop and define government. So everybody might think they know what government is, but we've got some precise things that indicate whether or not we have a government. First, are officers elected and appointed by elected officials? So we know elected officials are elected by the public, but if the organization's officers are elected or appointed by people who are elected, then that's one strong indication that we're looking at a government. If the government can unilaterally dissolve the nonprofit, if there's bylaws or rules that say if the nonprofit closes, resources go to the government, that's another strong indication that we have a government here. Finally, does this organization have the power to directly tax? If it does, it's likely to be a government organization. Well, a fair amount of government accounting is done based on the modified accrual basis, not the standard accrual basis that we're used to in financial reporting. We use the acronym MAB for modified accrual basis. Governments present fund statements using this. So here, revenues are recognized when measurable and available. So one thing to point out here then is you can, for example, have a pledge. And a pledge is measurable. You know how much a person pledged. But it may be that the funds aren't available yet. That whoever pledged the funds hasn't provided those. Well, it can be very hard to force somebody to make good on a pledge that they haven't made good on yet. So we might say that those revenues shouldn't be recognized because although they're measurable, they're not available. Also, when dealing with governments, we switch from the term expense to the term expenditures. And a lot of times people are a little confused. They think, well, is there really any difference, or is one just government lingo and one is, private lingo? And the answer is there is a slight bit of difference. First of all, expenditures are recognized when fund liability is incurred. So an important distinction then is if an expense is incurred by a business, just sort of the minute the business incurs it, it's as if because anybody in the business brought on the expense, the business is responsible for it. But with a government expenditure, there has to have been an authority. So somebody had to have the authority to create an expense and then do it. So it's an expenditure if fund liability has been incurred. If the rules say that this item could actually be contracted for. Here's the basic fund structure for governmental and nonprofit accounting. Governmental funds, we have the general fund. That's basically the catch-all. Every government will have at least one general fund, and usually that's all they have. Capital projects, these will be things that don't happen in the general fund. For example, a building fund might be a capital projects fund. Debt service. So for example, if the government has permitted bonds, the debt service of those bonds might be held in a separate fund. Any sort of special revenue. For example, sometimes the government will sell things, not necessarily trying to sell it for a profit. Might just be that they're trying to charge something to people who are using it, and then this might come up as a special revenue fund. Also, there are permanent governmental funds. Proprietary funds have a similar sound to for-profit organizations, and we see that two basic proprietary funds are enterprise and internal service funds. Finally, there are certain types of fiduciary funds, agency funds, pension funds, investment trust funds, and private purpose funds. Well, that's all for now. Good luck. Hope you do well with Chapter 1 and hope you enjoy the class.